Welcome, friends of the Greasy Shop Rag. Today we're going to take a look at a Husqvarna 565 chainsaw. The customer complaint is that it just doesn't run right. So before I do a test run on a saw, I usually look in the fuel tank, make sure there's enough fuel to do a test run. And in this case, what I found was, I found that I need to dump the fuel out and take a closer look at it. So I'm going to dump some into this funnel, which, by the way, is a radiator no-spill funnel. It would have come with adapters, and you can put it to an automotive radiator. And then when you lift the centerpiece out, the fluid will drain in. I kind of use it in a similar fashion. So the first thing I can do is look into the funnel and see what there is to see. And in this case, there's a lot of water in there to see. I'll see if I can give you a little bit closer look. Now the water is going to settle to the bottom. It's hard to tell in the funnel through the camera. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tap out the water because it settles to the bottom. I'm going to tap that out into a baby jar. Just taking it easy here so I try and get just the water into the funnel or into the jar. It's pretty close. I'll get another baby jar and we'll fill it up with what's left in the funnel. And we'll compare the two. So there's a lot of dirt and debris that came out, which doesn't concern me. The jar on the left is water and the jar on the right is fuel. And I actually calculated this out, and it turns out I had 25% water in this fuel tank. There's no way that saw is going to run right with 25% water in it. So I don't think that there's anything else that's actually our problem. We might stumble across some things, but if there was a running issue and there's 25% water in the fuel, I think that's your answer. These auto-tune saws, they should have the blue fuel filter on them, so we're going to take that filter off. But before we put the new filter on, we're going to pressure test the line. Certainly a hole in the fuel line could explain a running issue. But it's holding 10 pounds of pressure, so I know the line is good, and I know that the carburetor is tight. We got our new filter on. We'll just tuck that away in the tank. And then we'll throw our cap on there for now. There we go. So I guess the next thing to do should be to look into the cylinder, because I don't know how long this thing's been running or attempted to be run with this much water in it. I can see that a new air filter was put on it in an attempt to make it run right. Nothing wrong with that if the old filter was dirty. Let's take a look at the spark plug. It's the right plug, and it's about brand new. And there's nothing wrong with putting a new spark plug in it if the old one was worn or carbon fouled. Luckily, inside the cylinder looks good. So there wasn't any damage done from the water. At least nothing on the exhaust port side. That quick look I took, I can't see the intake side, but I wouldn't suspect there to be a problem on the intake side if I didn't see one on the exhaust side. But I want to take the carburetor off, and I want to take a look inside of that. And we want to see what the metering diaphragm and the fuel pump and a micro screen, what those all look like. So I'm pulling the two screws out that hold the carburetor down. They run through the air filter holder and then through the carburetor. And then the air filter holder sits in a couple of rubber saddles. We just pop it out of there. There's a fuel line right there on the carburetor. There's this fuel return hose that was on the back of the purge bulb. We've got, what do we got? I don't know why I'm throwing my hands up in the air. I think it's because the carburetor seems like it's new. I don't know if this was swapped out. So there's two tabs on the bottom of the carb that kind of lock it to the intake boot. And I removed those two tabs. Now I'm removing the fuel line. And we had already removed the throttle linkage, or the throttle cable, I should say. So we harvested one carburetor. Disconnect this last wire. Air filter box looks really clean, but there's a little bit of schmutz on there. We'll blow that off. I want to point out that there's a rubber gasket right there. And I was holding my thumb over it when I was cleaning that thing off, just so I wouldn't blow that gasket out of there. I'm looking at the carb again, and it just seems so new, or clean anyway, compared to the rest of the saw. I mean, the saw itself is kind of grimy and weathered, and there's some rust on the muffler there. But the carburetor looks really good. I mean, it doesn't really matter. Just an observation. I could be wrong. So we're going to open it up either way. I dropped my carb stand and bent one of the prongs on it. So on this side of the carburetor is the metering diaphragm. And we're going to pull this cover off of here. There's 4 screws. And I'm just going to lift the cover right off and set it on this piece of paper. Taking a look at the metering diaphragm, initially, I mean, it looks really good. Pliable. Moves nice and easy. Nothing wrong with that. Just going to blow that fuel away from there. And then a little bit of gasket scraping going on here. I'm happy with what I see on this side of the carburetor. So I'm putting it back together. If there's any concerns about not using a new gasket on there, I mean, I can pressure test it and make sure that it's still sealed. So let's take a look at the fuel pump side of the carburetor. In order to gain access to it, I have to remove this secondary throttle valve. There's 2 screws that hold it in place. And then we want to take a look at the linkage that runs to it, so we can get it put back together the same way. Then there's a single screw that holds the cover down. So our fuel pump itself looks good. There's no, it's not stretched out or anything like that. But I'm seeing a bubble of water right here. That's not good. And the micro screen itself looked kind of dark. I couldn't really tell if there was any scum or anything in it, but it just looked a little bit dark. So we're going to put a fresh one in. What I found is, sometimes when these are exposed to ethanol or water, after they dry, they're white and chalky. And that same stuff, that can plug up that screen and restrict the fuel flow into the carburetor and cause performance problems. So I'm putting a new screen in. And we're just going to put the old fuel pump and gasket back on. And I really have no concerns about this leaking. Our secondary throttle valve, that's going to get put into place. And the two little screws that hold it down. My audio from the camera is a little wonky. You see that fan running back in the corner? It was really hot in the shop this day, and we kept the doors down to try and keep the humidity down. And some of my audio was just not salvageable. That fan kind of was blowing against my camera and making some weird noises. So I plugged the wiring harness back into the carburetor, and then we snap it into the holder on the side of the carburetor. Now I want to try and get this carb to, I told you there was two little tangs on the bottom of that intake boot. We're going to get the carb lined up. We got to get the impulse fitting in the carburetor lined up with the boot. Got to get this throttle cable out of the way so it doesn't get sandwiched in between the carb and the intake boot. We're kind of getting it up close to where it belongs, but I'm not locking it in. But I'm trying to get the carburetor to snap into place, and it's just not going. I think we just need to push a little bit harder on there. Here we go. Now it locked into place. Now I'm putting the fuel line on the carburetor. This is the one that has the filter on it in the tank. And then we can get our throttle cable locked in. I just roll the throttle open a little bit and get that ferrule in position. And then when I pull the trigger, it kind of locks down in there and it won't come back out. This fuel line is the return line from the purge bulb back to the tank. Now I can put this air filter holder in place. Keeping in mind that I have to route these wires. You just kind of keep adjusting and wiggling till everything falls into place. That return line gets tucked up into that air filter holder. There's some clips that it goes into. And now this electrical connector that's supposed to be mounted on a bracket on top of the carburetor. It's kind of wonky. Takes a little bit of ciphering to figure out exactly how it goes back together. And as you can see, it's taken me a minute to figure it out. There we go. All right, short fuel line gets put back into place. Wiring harness gets clipped down in the holder. And the last connection is made. Looks good. We'll bolt the carburetor back down. These are T20 bolt heads. We don't want to get carried away torquing on this thing. Yeah, that looks good. All right. Put our air filter on here. Put the top cover on. And we'll fill it up with gas. We'll see if we can get this thing started. So the only thing we really fixed was that we removed the water from the system. Priming up. primed right up. So what happened here is I got interrupted. I got called away from the bench, and when I came back, I fired up the saw and it ran great, and I was all happy about it until I realized I forgot to hit the record button. So what you're going to witness here is a warm restart. I don't like to do that in the videos. I like to make it one continuous, seamless, unended run toward the end of the video. But that just didn't happen here. So we'll give this thing a try, see if it starts. And if it does, then that's all I'm going to have for you on the Husqvarna 565. It just didn't run right because it had too much water in the fuel. Thanks for watching. Later.